Good afternoon, everyone. I have the pleasure today of introducing our speaker, Professor Glenda Carpio. I'm in English and African American Studies. It's my special pleasure to introduce him today. He'll be speaking on Ellison, laughter, and visibility. As you know, he is the Sterling Professor of English at Yale, where he has served in the faculty since 1988. His scholarly and teaching specialties are in British Romanticism. At Yale, Bromwich has taught the major English poets course in the history politics section of Directed Studies, the Directed Studies curriculum there. He has given lectures on Romanticism and on rhetorical persuasion, seminars on Wordsworth, Shelley, Stevens, Burke, Shakespeare, and Lincoln. He has also done collaborative seminars on French and American cinema. He, as if you've been here all 3 days, has spoken on Douglas and Lincoln, on Du Bois, in the question of representation and dissent. And today he will be taking us to a very rich field, African American humor, specifically laughter and visibility, and Ellison. Join me in welcoming Professor Bromwich.
Thank you, and I'm appreciative of being introduced by a scholar of this subject of laughter and visibility and Black culture. It's a great subject and still, I think, not enough yet written about. And I will contribute to it as very local and somewhat arbitrarily connected with material in the previous lectures. Don't withhold your laughter at the extreme sweat that I've broken out into, which could be mistaken for nervousness, and maybe is, but I ran all the way because I lost track of time correcting this thing. The essay, as a form, has always been understood as a domain for the play of imaginative virtuosity. If you want to draw your readers with a story, a novel is what you must write, and by the terms of an unwritten contract, the reader will expect memorable characters and scenes, or anyway, a vivid souvenir of reality. What the author thinks of the materials is extracurricular business. The more we become aware of a point of view that holds opinions and dispenses observations without compunction, the less pristine and possibly the more irritating the performance. The modern conventions of the novel have trained us to think this way. The aesthetic rigor of Flaubert and Henry James set the standard of imaginative fictional prose from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century, and it was never far from the minds of novelists and critics, even whose taste seemed to point in another direction, toward, say, Dickens or Tolstoy or Zola. By contrast, the very uncertainty of the conventions that govern the essay made it an inviting area for experiment, and still do. For an analogy, we might consider the ranked genres of painting around the year 1800. The highest prestige was commanded then by history painting, with portrait, landscape, and still life following at a respectful distance. By 1920 or so, that ordering of that art had changed beyond recognition. History became the province of book illustrators, and no painter of high reputation would pick up the commission for a state portrait. Has the novel become something like history painting, so that writers of real imaginative energy have in effect to style themselves history painters while sowing their best moments with landscape, portrait, and still life, in short, the materials of essay writing? Ralph Ellison thought of himself as a novelist, a conscious inheritor of the American tradition of Melville, Hemingway, and Faulkner. He would have considered any other description a derogation from his dignity. I think that's true of all the writers of that generation. Norman Mailer, right to the end, wanted to be thought of as a novelist, though most people could tell his best work was in other directions starting in the mid-50s. Yet Ellison chose to publish 3 books in his lifetime, and 2 were books of essays. His novel, Invisible Man, from the moment it appeared, was garlanded with praise and honors no possible sequel could have matched. And he spent the last 4 decades of his life working at an unfinished and probably unfinishable novel in which the assorted materials of sermon, oration, harangue, antiphonal dialogue, and phantasmagoria wouldn't submit to the proper molding of plot and character. It looks as if Ellison bound himself to a lifelong quest to escape the free-form voice of the essay that he actually made his own. 2 of the best remembered parts of Invisible Man are the essay-like prologue and epilogue, whose challenges and doubts and obiter dicta it seems natural to treat as Ellison's own voice speaking. Meanwhile, there are the books of essays, Shadow and Act and Going to the Territory, both of them offered as journeyman work while he was otherwise occupied. I'll be interpreting an essay from each of those books, in both cases the longest and most impressive in the book. The first, a polemic on the freedom of the artist. The second, an exuberant fable and survey of the perplexities of the color line. The World and the Jug has become by far the better-known performance, but it's the later essay, an extravagance of laughter, that seems to me ultimately the more searching and provocative of the two, indeed a masterpiece in a category all its own. Ellison wrote The World and the Jug to clarify his aims as a novelist and distinguish them from the aims of a pamphleteer or political activist. He adopts here and sustains a posture of weary explanation, suitable, he would have us believe, to the unhappy necessity of the occasion. He's replying, as if reluctantly, to an essay of literary and political criticism by Irving Howe called Black Boys and Native Sons. Let me say a word about that context. Howe was by this time a well-known critic and biographer, the editor of the socialist magazine Dissent, and close to the partisan review circle, a milieu Ellison respected deeply and which he must have supposed himself a part-time member of. At a high moment of the national civil rights movement in the 1960s, Howe published in the autumn 1963 issue of Dissent the essay Black Boys and Native Sons, which questioned the aesthetic stance from which James Baldwin, in a famous essay of his own, had depreciated the work of Richard Wright for its serviceability to the demands of mere political protest. That's early Baldwin, but republished in a later collection of his. The vocation of the artist, so Baldwin argued, required a sort of discipline quite alien to Richard Wright, a willing detachment from the irritations and exigencies of any given political moment. And Ellison, in certain passages of Invisible Man, which could be read as speaking the sentiments of the author, and in some of his shorter writings too, had seemed to invoke a similar idea of aesthetic purity against the low standing of protest literature. But was it realistically possible, Howe asked, for a black writer at this moment, autumn 1963, to reject altogether the function of protest as if that were not part of a writer's unique function as an imaginative witness of life? He quoted Baldwin's sentence, quote, "One writes out of one thing only, one's own experience," and wondered how much or how little that implied. And this is Howe, question of his, asked of Baldwin, and implicitly of Ellison too. What then was the experience of a man with a black skin? What could it be in this country? How could a Negro put pen to paper? How could he so much as think or breathe without some impulsion to protest, be it harsh or mild, political or private, released or buried? There were truths about the condition of individual black men or women not to be evaded by the black writer, truths about the sociology of his existence, as Howe put it with the abstract word sociology placed in quotation marks, to which writers of the caliber of Baldwin and Ellison were bound to testify whether they willed it or not. To the extent that they shunned this bearing of witness, their work was both imaginatively and politically impoverished, and Howe found evidence here in the formal stiffness of Baldwin's first 2 novels and the over-emphatic anti-communist satire and avowals of cultural freedom in Invisible Man, a book which overall he had praised warmly when it came out 10 years earlier, and had supported in voting for the National Book Award. Now, and I should say, that essay is published in Dissent. Howe invited Ellison to reply in Dissent. He said no. Then, these are small circulation magazines. Then Ellison was invited by Mike Kolach of the New Leader to respond to the essay by Howe there in the New Leader. And Ellison said yes, and then did it at length. Ellison was piqued by the assumption that pain and ferocity are invariable or inevitable features of black experience in America. Howe, he said, had turned Ellison and Baldwin into the villains of his essay, quote, black boys masquerading as native sons. Howe, in fact, had been saying that Baldwin and Ellison themselves must have known in experience something of the pain to which Wright gave adequate testimony. But in a very effective polemical stroke, Ellison set out to answer a hidden accusation he detected here. For Howe seemed to accuse Ellison and Baldwin of pretending to be all-American writers, native sons to the nation itself, when really they were as closely connected as Wright to the sources of rage and the promptings of political commitment. Howe spoke of the impurity of the novel as a genre, quote, an inherently ambiguous genre. It strains toward formal autonomy and can seldom avoid being public gesture. But Ellison corrects that formulation as follows, quote, I would have said the novel is always a public gesture, though not necessarily a political one. That is a fair criticism and an interesting modification. And it brings out, I think, a larger difference between the contesting views. Ellison cherished, in a way that Howe did not, the ideal of a public life and a general culture unmixed with the baser matter of politics. But it's the less immediately controversial parts of Ellison's essay that have rightly been emphasized by most commentators. In response to Howe's claim that there is a constant pressure on the black writer's literary work which comes with, quote, a pain and ferocity that nothing could remove, Ellison objects to the assumption that, quote, unrelieved suffering is the only, quote, real Negro experience and that the true Negro writer must be ferocious. On the contrary, he says, here comes a quotation of some length, there is also an American Negro tradition which teaches one to deflect racial provocation and to master and contain pain. It is a tradition which abhors as obscene any trading on one's own anguish for gain or sympathy, which springs from a desire to deny the harshness of existence, not from a desire to deny the harshness of existence, but from a will to deal with it as men at their best have always done. It takes fortitude to be a man and no less to be an artist. Perhaps it takes even more if the black man would be an artist. If so, there are no exemptions. It would seem to me, therefore, that the question of how the sociology of his existence presses upon the Negro writer's work depends upon how much of his life the individual writer is able to transform into art. What moves a writer to eloquence is less meaningful than what he makes of it. And there follows something like a credo. Quote, true novels, this is Ellison, even when most pessimistic and bitter, arise out of an impulse to celebrate human life and therefore are ritualistic and ceremonial at their core. An impulse to celebrate human life. That statement is very broad, and it is questionable in detail. To cite only two novels that Ellison himself greatly admired, did The Confidence Man or The Red Badge of Courage arise out of an impulse to celebrate life? Or should we take Ellison to mean that the authors of those books left copious evidence of their full immersion in a life which, in order to write as they did, they must have loved as much as they deplored? But the idea of celebration and ceremony has deep sources in Ellison's thinking about comedy, a subject to which I'll return. The burden, anyway, from which in 1963 he felt he must detach himself was the burden of social significance that made for the self-imposed limitations of a book like Native Son. Quote, Quote, Wright could imagine Bigger Thomas, but Bigger could not possibly imagine Richard Wright. Wright saw to that. Ellison's hostility here toward a socialist critic whom he treats as an accuser has going under it a palpable secondary motive, namely his rivalry with the author of Black Boy and Native Son, a competitive drive that incorporates both hauteur and resentment. Hauteur because Ellison, with some warrant, considered himself the superior of Richard Wright in the workmanship of style, sentence by sentence. But resentment, too, because they shared a great subject and Wright had come to it first. The sense of rivalry can be traced as far back as 1952, the year before the publication of Invisible Man, when Ellison wrote in a letter to Albert Murray, quote, we've taken, and he and Murray are finishing their books at the same time, we've taken on in our first books a task of defining reality which none of the other boys had the equipment to handle, except Wright, and he could never bring himself to conceive a character as complicated as himself. I guess he was too profoundly dissatisfied with his life, his past life, to look too long in the mirror, and no doubt he longed for something, some way of life so drastically different that it would have few points of contact with what he knew or the people he knew it with. Ellison's deepest criticism may have come to this, that Wright had contrived to evade the difficulty of acknowledging the fullness of knowledge given by his double consciousness. Wright, who knew of things beyond the veil, Ellison would be saying, chose to hide his protagonist behind it. He allowed anger or the mask of anger to overwhelm his capacity to reflect the complex feelings that constituted his life. Wright could imagine Bigger Thomas, but Bigger Thomas could never have imagined Richard Wright. The counterstatement for Ellison against the temptation of a retreat into primitive or simplified posture was a form of non-didactic art which could serve at once as a record of suffering and a stay against suffering. Such a celebratory art, Ellison, sometimes in collaboration with his friend Murray, would increasingly come to identify with the blues. There was never a less didactic art than jazz. What then are we to make of the fact, that's my sentence, by the way, and I believe it. I think Ellison believed it too, though we admire somewhat different people somewhat differently. There was never a less didactic art. What then are we to make of the fact that the young Ellison had published and the mature Ellison elected to reprint 2 decades later a wholly appreciative review of Black Boy under the title Richard Wright's Blues? But I've so far neglected a peculiar detail of Ellison's self-defense, which in the length of his 2-part reply to How grows far more insistently personal than might seem warranted by the essay that provoked him. He's concerned to respond most particularly to what he takes to be an insinuation that he has suppressed a native anger of his own. Why, he turns and asks of How again, why was it possible for me to write as I write only because Richard Wright, released his anger? Can't I be allowed to release my own? What does How know of my acquaintance with violence, or the shape of my courage, or the intensity of my anger? I suggest that my credentials are at least as valid as Wright's, and it is possible that I've lived through and committed even more violence than he. He's really, we'll talk about this later. And adopting the stance of the American individual reading out a lesson in the freedom of the arts to a presumptive cultural commissar, Ellison now steps forward to take his strongest shot. Your wish, he tells his interlocutor, your wish to discipline me according to the demands of protest is a thing I fear more than the violence of a Southern sheriff. To this particular challenge, Irving Howe replied in the pages of The New Leader, quote, I would consider it a personal slur on my honor if I thought Ellison was in control of himself when he wrote those sentences. There was, in truth, a good deal of charade in Ellison's posture of resisting a compelling demand for propagandistic conformity. Both writers knew this. Howe, as a young man in the late 1930s and early 40s, had been a Trotskyist, quite uncompromising in his opposition to Stalinist control of the arts, whereas Ellison, who rode a high horse of aesthetic freedom in 1963, had been close to the American Communist Party for many years after the Hitler-Stalin Pact. In fact, during the years of the Popular Front, the time of prescribed obedience to the imperatives of protest art, it had been Ellison and not Howe that followed the party line. The satirical treatment of the brotherhood in the middle chapters of Invisible Man is in this respect a very misleading guide to the feelings and conduct of the author at that time. Before going on to Ellison's assertion of his personal principle, I want to quote briefly again from Howe's reply to The World in the Jug. I think it helped. You can only find it now on JSTOR. You have to go back to the archives of The New Leader. I think it helps clarify the issue between them. And one needs the connective matter for another reason. Ellison, in Shadow and Act, chose to reprint both his original essay and his counter-response to Howe's reply from the pages of The New Leader. But there's a blank space here because Ellison doesn't reprint or quote from or summarize Howe's response, in spite of the unusually explicit use he makes of it. Howe took care to qualify the image of protest on command, which Ellison had seemed to define so as to include only artists of inferior rank. And this is from his reply. Quote, Ellison seems to fear that describing his novel as a protest novel, which in part it surely is, somehow constitutes an act of denigration. But such a description does no worse than, says Howe, to place him in the company of Zola and Dreiser, Dickens and Melville, and even, if he can bear it, Richard Wright. Howe then summons the example of a Russian writer of an earlier period when the conflict between the morality of art and the morale of political protest was fiercely debated. Quote, Chekhov, probably as devoted to the purity of art as Ralph Ellison, dragged himself from a sickbed to visit the penal colony at Sakhalin Island and speak to the conscience of his country about the tormented prisoners. Was Chekhov right in doing what he did? I don't know. All I would say is that the trip to Sakhalin was, for him, necessary, and in my view of things, noble. Well, in the face of that example, Ellison relaxed his posture a little and said that he never meant to dissociate himself from the civil rights movement of the year 1963, and young black people were bound to realize that whether he said so or not, he was in the fight and had signed up for the duration. His final assertion of individuality and artistic independence remembers certain well-known phrases from both Henry James and W.E.B. Du Bois without mentioning the name of either predecessor. And this is that culminating assertion by Ellison that I'm quoting now. Being a Negro American has to do with a special relation to national ideals and the national conduct, and with a tragicomic attitude towards the universe. It has to do with that special sense of predicament and fate, which gives direction and resonance to the freedom movement. It involves a rugged initiation into the mysteries and rights of color. It imposes the uneasy burden and occasional joy of a complex double vision, a fluid, ambivalent response to men and events, which represents, at its finest, a profoundly civilized adjustment to the cost of being human in the modern world. The tragic-comic attitude comes from the experiencer being also an observer, one acquainted with ambivalence, it seems, as the narrator says in the prologue of Invisible Man. Now, in those same early pages of Ellison's novel, the tragicomic perspective had been associated with the blues. Quote, perhaps I like Louis Armstrong because he's made poetry out of being invisible. I think it must be because he's unaware that he is invisible. I'm not sure what to make of this remark or whether we're to take it as an intelligent comment on Armstrong. What's clear is that at this moment in the prologue of his novel, Ellison was intent on dividing the artist who perceives from the person who lives. The comic perspective, it would seem, isn't available to the person who acts and suffers, the person mired in experience itself. Rather, it belongs to the artist, the interpreter of life, in this case, Ellison, the narrator, and not the unnamed protagonist of Invisible Man. Hemingway, in Death in the Afternoon, says the artist differs from other men in having a quicker ratio to the passage of time. Ellison, as I read him, suggests in The Voice of Invisible Man that the Negro American has potentially a more adequate, more unpredictable, and therefore a more responsive ratio to the passage of time than is available to anyone who is not by compulsion acquainted with such ambivalence. This is brought out in the prologue of that novel by the anecdote of the trained prizefighter boxing against the yokel. The prizefighter was seen to be commanding, and he pounded his victim with 100 blows against the defensive arms raised in stunned surprise. It is, Ellison's words, one violent flow of rapid rhythmic motion until the yokel stepped in and with one blow, still Ellison, knocked science, speed, and footwork as cold as a well-digger's posterior. The smart money hit the canvas. The long shot got the nod. The yokel had simply stepped inside of his opponent's sense of time. So Ellison can be a very, 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 very good writer. The all-importance of biding your time and interrupting your opponent's time is invoked again later in the prologue in defense of Ellison's ruling conceit in the novel. He's writing out his experience underground in a hole that is extremely well lit by electricity he has rerouted and stolen from the city supply. A hibernation, he argues, is a covert preparation for more overt action. So let's say the narrator is the yokel who turns out to be master of a subtler science. Patience is part of it. Hence the comedy when your patience runs out and you step into your enemy's complacent sense of time. Does this justify Ellison's protagonist saying at the end of Invisible Man, quote, "My world has become one of infinite possibilities"? An ironic sentence it may be, but one that Howe jibbed at, and Ellison accused him of not understanding the irony of. And how does comedy, in a larger sense, come into the work of narrating the history and experience of the color line? Here I'll need to bring in another critic, Kenneth Burke, but a theory of laughter, such as Burke proposes, can easily spoil the most delicate joke, and I want first to explore the tragic comedy, or rather the attitude of comedy, overlaying facts that might be tragic in Ellison's essay of 1985, An Extravagance of Laughter. He says at the start of it that he means this essay to be, quote, "an apology for an offense of which I was guilty back in the 1930s. The offense was an explosion of laughter that escaped from him unmeant and out of proportion to the event when he looked at the grotesque antics of the white trash characters in the stage production of Erskine Caldwell's Tobacco Road. For Caldwell's comedy, Ellison's words now, plunged me quite unexpectedly into the deepest levels of a most American realm of the absurd, while providing me with the magical wings with which to ascend back to a world which, for all his having knocked it out quite out of kilter, I then found more rational." It all goes back to his first trip north as a young man, says Ellison. On his arrival in New York and his first walks around the streets of the city, coming as he did from Oklahoma, he felt an unfamiliarity as of walking on a recently mended leg without the support of a cast. New York was so much more open, and in its racial composition, more integrated, at least on the surface, than anything he had encountered in the South. And most surprisingly, he discovers there are things about equality that he does not like. The absence of gallantry, for example. He offers an illustration. This is the first such anecdote in this 50-page long essay. A huge white woman on a subway comes into outright collision almost with a small Negro man as they hurtle themselves toward the same seat on the train. She with an armful of bundles, he with a large suitcase. She wins and gets the seat, but by a turn of her hip, accidentally spins him into her own lap. The man jumps free. Ellison has visions of race riot. But then, this is New York, the man let out an exasperated, "Hell, you can have it, I don't want it." And he reports, quote, "The crowd of passengers simply looked on and laughed." It wouldn't have happened like that in the South. He pursues his New York investigations with an almost anthropological impartiality. As he rides on the buses of the city, taking any seat he likes, front or back, quote, I asked myself whether a seat at the back of the bus wasn't actually more desirable than a seat at the front. Why? Because of better legroom, but also, quote, the more inclusive perspective of goings-on both inside and outside the bus. Quote, I found the answer obvious and quite amusing. Amusing is a word he uses in a complex way. It's something a little bit stunned and aware in the sense of being amused. By recognition achieved through meditation on the contrast, he's able to understand something about his previous experience too. Quote, a southern bus was a contraption contrived by laying the South social pyramid on its side, knocking out a few strategic holes, and rendering it vehicular through the addition of engine, windows, and wheels. It was, quote, at least for Negroes, as unpredictable as a trip in a spaceship doomed to be caught in the time warp of history. That man-made fourth dimension which ever confounds our American grasp of real or actual time or duration. People here who have come to the preceding lectures may want to keep count of certain words, relevant words and ideas. Laughter is one, but so is the state of being amused. Time is another, and finally, come back to it, gratitude, a feeling that may actually come through the medium of laughter with a sense that shocks us out of mere obedience to the laws of behavior, something that sets us to musing. A small recognition has been set off even on the bus. Ellison says, the semi-open structure of American society in which you can sit anywhere carries with it, quote, opportunities and hazards of upward mobility and downward mobility. Comic recognition was available in the South, but with a grimmer undertone and a risk always hovering nearby. And Ellison now spins out an anecdote, part legend and fable, with which he and his, in fact, it's all legend and fable, with which he and his college friends at Tuskegee used to entertain themselves, concerning a hapless Negro by the name of White, W-H-Y-T-E, who gets stopped by a pair of corrupt policemen in the town of Phoenix City. That's P-H-E-N-I-X, and if you know the great low-budget film noir, The Phoenix City Story, you have some idea of that awful place. Sorry if anybody here is from there. A town notorious for its perils as a speed trap that exposed all passers through to legal extortion, often accompanied by brutality of abuse. The story of the unlucky black man, White, was, quote, a theme for tall tale improvisation. Thus was violence transcended with cruel but homeopathic laughter. The cops, so the story runs, of Phoenix City stop him, and the more he insists that his name is White, the harder they beat him. The arbitrariness of the name proved a match for the arbitrariness of color as a cause for inflicting suffering by white authorities, W-H-I-T-E. The baffled stupidity and rage of the police, and he doesn't get beaten to death, he just gets beaten up badly. The baffled stupidity and rage of the police is as much a butt of the story as the clueless honesty of the poor intercepted traveler, White. A suggestion that emerges from this tall tale is the precariousness of the hold of poor whites on a claim of respectable superiority that is in fact as thin as the paper of a traffic citation or a single letter of a one-syllable name. The household of the family of Jeter Lester in Tobacco Road, as the young Ellison watches the play, appears to bring out a related truth. The incest, rapacity, jealousy, and mean skullduggery involved in the relations of these family members with each other is part of their necessary equipment for survival, even if the humor of it is even if the humor of it is hardly experienced by the characters themselves, but only conveyed to the audience. In brief, says Ellison, the Lester family, characters in Tobacco Road, is as seedy as the house in which they live. They have plunged through the floor of civilized humanity. That's a word he used earlier, isn't it? He plunged me back into memories of the South, and they have themselves been plunged downward mobility, through the floor of civilized humanity, and even the religion, which had once given a semblance of order to their lives, had become as superstitious as that which the stereotypes attribute to Negroes. Well, what good could come of watching such a spectacle? Ellison here quotes Kenneth Burke's formulation, quote, comedy should enable us to be observers of ourselves while acting. Its ultimate end would not be passiveness, but maximum consciousness. And one may recall the oversupply of light bulbs in the basement hole occupied by the narrator of Invisible Man as a sort of comically literal metaphor of such consciousness. Jeter, Ellison now remarks, elaborating this theory of comedy, the poor white as fool was made to act the clown in order to save the audience's sanity. The novelist Caldwell, and this play is adapted by someone else, but it's the main means by which he became so popular to a wide audience. The novelist Caldwell was able to perform this trick of comedy because sometime during the Depression, he, quote, appears to have recognized the universal swindle of the compulsion felt by Americans to live with a second self. They are all Americans, self-confidence men. That's Ellison's good phrase. They are all self-confidence men, no matter how ill-prepared, who have half believe in the odds they place on themselves. And Caldwell, quote, responding to the imbalance which was shaking American social hierarchy, mid-30s, from its apex to its base, placed the yoke-like anti-Negro stereotypes upon the necks of whites, and his audience reacted with a shock of recognition. But it was a more personal shock that prompted Ellison's own laughter at his moment of recognition. Quote, and this is a long passage. For me, the shock of Caldwell's art began when Ellie Mae and Love were swept, that was interesting, L-O-V-W, anyway. For me, the shock of Caldwell's art began when Ellie Mae and Love were swept up by a forbidden sexual attraction so strong that, uttering sounds of animal passion, they went floundering and skittering back to back across the stage in the startling action which Father Jeter, that randy atom in an Eden gone to weed, named horsing. For when the two went into their bizarre choreography of sexual frustration, I was reduced to such helpless laughter that I distracted the entire balcony and embarrassed both myself and my host. It was a terrible moment. And the host, by the way, is not Caldwell, the host is Langston Hughes. It was a terrible moment, for before I could regain control, more attention was being directed toward me than at the action unfolding on the stage. Then it was as though I had been stripped naked, kicked out of a low-flying plane onto an Alabama road and ordered to laugh for my life. I laughed and laughed, bending and straightening in a virtual, uncontrollable cloud and dam burst of laughter, a self-immolation of laughter over which I had no control. And yet I was hypersensitive to what was happening around me, a fact which left me all the more embarrassed. It was as though Erskine Caldwell had snared me as an offstage instrument for extending the range of his outrageous plotting, and I mean with a cacophony of minor thirds and flatted fifths voiced fortissimo by braying gut bucket brasses. Some sections of this New York audience, as they look up and see the young black man laughing uncontrollably, cheer him on, while others boo. And finally, the actors themselves on stage shield their eyes to comprehend the source of the commotion. It's this incident of actual life that then ushers in the central fable of the essay, the fable of laughing barrels. Part of the magic is that this fantasia seems an eminently plausible extension of the ordinary rituals of the segregated South. And I must confess that between my own first and second, and again between my second and third reading of this essay, I, a credulous northerner and raised on the West Coast, couldn't remember whether the barrels were a fiction or just a historical oddity of a more than usually repressive southern town. Ellison introduces the tale as a fiction only in a passing phrase, but he spins it out at such length that it becomes as good as real. Negroes, so his fable runs, have a propensity to laugh at improbable and improper moments, and this town, one town in the South, has created a row or phalanx of laughing barrels, like parking spaces, right? But they're barrels at the end of them, to which they're compelled by custom to retire when the fit of laughter strikes. They do this to prevent their embarrassment, akin to what Ellison felt as spectator of the performance of Tobacco Road, but also to veil their own shock and bewilderment at the cause of the laughter and to protect the white people who don't know what to make of it. So the embarrassment is two-sided and then some. The mad repression of self-knowledge and social understanding is concealed by both the agents and the witnesses of this unmeant hilarity. Ellison explains, this is within the fable within the anecdote about Caldwell. Nor did it help that many of the town's whites suspected that when a Negro had his head thrust into a laughing barrel, he became endowed with a strange form of extrasensory perception, or second sight, which allowed him to respond uproariously to their own unwilling participation. And when such reversals occurred, the white assumed that in some mysterious fashion, the Negro involved was not only laughing at himself laughing, but it was also laughing at them laughing, at his laughing, against their own most determined wills. And if such was the truth, it suggested that somehow a Negro, and this meant any Negro, could become with a single hoot and cackle both the source and master of an outrageous and untenable situation. It's plain to any reader that the laughing barrel myth is a counterpart, and that it's offered as a comic antidote to the brutal fact of lynch mobs. In the one case, Negroes in the mass unburden themselves of their common anxiety and insight in a therapy guarded by seclusion. The practice is jealously regarded and treated as an occult event, but also an assertion of an otherwise forbidden humanity. In the other case, one black is set upon by many whites in order to cut the bonds of common humanity altogether. So far, though the laughter in the theater has been personal to Ellison, the relationship to his own experience has seemed generic. But other recognitions are on the way. The sexual frustrations of the poor whites on stage, he says, mirrored his own faltering, youthful experiences of sex. Quote, wasn't Ellie Mae's and Love's horsing all over the stage of Tobacco Road embarrassingly symbolic of my own frustrations as a healthy young man whose sexual outlet was limited for the most part to belly rubbing with girls met casually at public dances? It was, and it wasn't, depending upon my willingness to make or withhold a human identification. Actually, I had no choice but to identify, for Caldwell's art had seen to that. Interesting repetition of the phrase he uses on Wright. Wright had seen to that. And he continues, there was much more of Jeter Lester's outrageousness in my past than I had ever imagined, and quite a bit of it showed up on my side of the color line. So though he had, quote, thought of the Lester type as being, in the Negro folk phrase, a heap of whiteness gone to waste, the type reveals itself to be much more than that. His experience of the play pulled him back, jerked him outside himself. The great final sentence of the essay will speak of a new emotion that follows a mutual recognition between black and white. Given my background and yearnings, there was no question but that I needed such redemption. And for that, I'm eternally grateful to Erskine Caldwell, Southerner, American humanist, and mighty destroyer of laughing barrels. Kenneth Burke was the literary critic to whom Ellison often pointed as a large influence on his work, and Arnold Rampersad, in his biography of Ellison, judges that Burke's, quote, ideas about literary form were the dominant force to shape his writing in the years 1942 to 52, the years of the conception and writing of Invisible Man. Rampersad cites in particular Ellison's attendance at a lecture delivered by Burke at the New School for Social Research on the rhetoric of Hitler's battle. That is, it's a reading of the book Mein Kampf. Ellison there was intrigued by the impartial analysis Burke offered of the sources of Hitler's demagogic effectiveness. The propaganda of Hitler was bad medicine, but to arrive at the good medicine that could serve as antidote to his rhetoric, Americans had to give considerable thought to the methods by which such writing and speeches worked to divide and unify. Such an antidote would lead its audience out from passive suffering through recognition, finally to action. This passage required a comic perspective that would track baneful policies to their origins and give coherence to the motives of reform without the artifice of a scapegoat. Though this lecture provoked a heated discussion at the New School, presumably from people who'd looked for a straightforward condemnation, Ellison felt the rightness of Burke's mode of analysis, and he seems to have read with care the book of 1941, The Philosophy of Literary Form, in which Burke published that lecture along with several other pieces from the late 30s concerned with the Depression and the coming war. The most interesting of these essays, I think, for Ellison's comic purposes, must have been one called War, Response, and Contradiction. Burke there asked a curious question, namely whether one can succeed more reliably in turning people against war by emphasizing the sheer horror of a past war, or by admitting its glory too, and even its pleasures, while doing justice to the brutality and irreparable loss. People are drawn to scenes of sacrifice, so the straight anti-war appeal may misfire. The whole field of persuasion and effect is ambiguous, in fact, and the writer who would offer good medicine will have to be a master of that ambiguity. Quote, this is Kenneth Burke now, a moral attitude may be adopted by one class, for instance, to help them in their work, and may be promoted by another class to keep them at their work. Notice the affinity here with Ellison's rejection of the inherited idea that the experience of blacks under segregation was all bad. He would in fact deny that this was true even of the black experience under slavery. He said that. Is it possible that a less than catastrophic treatment, which gives up the frame of victor and victim, can stay faithful to the facts and implicate the audience more intimately and issue in a response likely to serve the cause of general solidarity and sympathy? I wish to offer evidence, says Burke, for suspecting that irrationality or contradictoriness of response is basic to human psychology, not merely as error, but for sound biological reasons, and this particularly at those depths of human sensitiveness which are implicated in the religious, ethical, poetic, or volitional aspects of man. In fighting a great oncoming evil, then, or an already existing one that has no immediate remedy, opposition may have to take the form initially of defensive art. Ellison had found the clue when he embarked on the composition of Invisible Man, but with the essay An Extravagance of Laughter, he found his appropriate form. Final note about the relationship between comedy and tragedy as aesthetic responses to the recognition of cruelty and suffering. In the text of Invisible Man and in essays he wrote in the 1950s and 60s, Ellison speaks often of the absurd. You've heard that word come up once or twice in passages I read. And it's often clear in the context, and Rampersad confirms this, that he was influenced by Unamuno's tragic sense of life and by the myth of Sisyphus and other writings of Camus. Absurdity, the word and the idea, as expounded by these writers, can track itself to tragedy or comedy alternatively. But Kenneth Burke in 1940 had spoken of a hidden danger of tragedy, which stemmed from the perverse satisfactions of achieved hopelessness and the liability of the tragic hero and scapegoat to pass equally as an object of sympathy and of reproach. Also, there's an unwarranted fatalism that may be induced by tragedy above all, as if a personified fate had acted with a purpose against the hero and scapegoat. Are we meant to sympathize with Oedipus, with Hamlet, with Bigger Thomas? All of them murderers. We ought to see that this question is misplaced when it's asked of a work of art. And comedy prevents that error by resolving, in a resonant phrase Ellison used on another occasion, to change the joke and slip the yoke. It does so by stepping inside our sense of time, a joke from the start on all of us who would wish to be the heroes of our own lives. By comedy, and this I think is the ceremony, the celebration that Ellison had in mind elsewhere, by comedy we're placed outside the momentum of the plot and freed from the vulgar need for identification. But the choice of we don't read comedies to get to the end if we know they're comedies, but we do read tragedies for the suffering in the end. But the choice of the comic frame was for Ellison, as it must be for any writer, to some extent arbitrary, a matter of temperament. How then to sum up the unique result, the authority and delicacy of his achievement in An Extravagance of Laughter? In his message, this message to Erskine Caldwell, delivered more than 4 decades after his embarrassment as a spectator so singular in his amusement at the characters of Travel of Tobacco Road, he had traveled a long distance, not only from Oklahoma and Tuskegee, but from the monstrous tragic perspective of the battle royal of Invisible Man, where a set of young black men are herded together to flail at each other blindfold for the entertainment of a wide audience, and then one of them is forced to read out a letter of gratitude. The tragic blindness of that scene of suffering and unrelieved humiliation has given way to the mysterious comic voicelessness of the laughing barrels. Laughter is explosive and transgressive, and yet for all that, laughter can't be punished, or it almost never is, especially when the motive is obscure and the provoked thoughts are somehow muffled or sublimated. A ritual such as the forced retreat to the laughing barrel is a common device for the maintenance of the order of society. I mean, rituals like that, not that one. So much so that, as I said, it was possible for at least one reader it seemed possible that Ellison was recounting an anecdote, not a fable, and in reading the essay aloud, I have found at least one other fall into the same error. The aim of such rituals is to keep at a distance the secret door that would disclose our tacit recognition of the swindle of race equality and of many other and smaller social artifices. Hence the embarrassment associated with the audibility of unpermitted laughter, the thing that can't be forbidden but just isn't done. There's an embarrassment at the audibility and a deeper embarrassment that comes from the sudden exposure and visibility of the habits we take for granted or customs we mistake for morals. This transgression, says Ellison, is something to be grateful for. It is one of the ruses by which human nature in American society has partly emancipated itself without conscious intent. In seeing two races at once with a double consciousness, in his letter to a white novelist, which is almost the form adopted by his essay, Ralph Ellison paid the most improbable of debts with a comically delayed acknowledgement, and from his late eminence to Caldwell's late obscurity, he crossed the color line. Thank you.
Great, thank you, David. That was amazing. It was wonderful. Matt tells us we have to get out of here we have to end by 5:20, so we have plenty of time.
We have 5 minutes to eat and 10 minutes to talk.
Where is he? Well, I wanted to see if he meant our Q&A had to, but anyway, we'll proceed. Just one footnote. Ellison is riffing on a poem by Sterling Brown called It's Slim in Hell, right? It's Slim in Hell, which is that the black people in the South, it was so racist that you had to laugh in a telephone booth. And he did a whole slim cycle. But he never in a million years would have footnoted anybody black. I mean, Ralph Ellison just was, Ellison had his own interracial politics.
He seldom footnotes white Americans
people
who are not good and dead.
Yeah, right.
But
so that would be something that you might look at. And it was in his poem, a book of poems, Southern Road, in 1931.
Thank you.
And the other thing that was interesting, one of the reasons I was excited about, I was excited about all your lectures, but I've been thinking a lot about laughter because in 1680, a man called Morgan Godwin published a book called The Negro Indians Advocate. And as you know, one of the things I'm interested in is sort of discourse on race and reason. And he says, this is 1680, that Negroes are human because of two things, risibility and discourse, the capacity to laugh. And so I was very interested in trying to find a precedent for this idea that laughter would be a hallmark of humanity, a sign that you were actually human, because people had a long time, then it would become writing and the creation of the arts and sciences with Hume and Kant. But I wonder if you've thought about that. I never believed, by the way, that this Ellison thing actually happened. Ellison made up all kind of shit. And a black man laughing at the Tobacco Road.
You think that's a tall tale?
They would have thrown his ass out in 2 seconds. Somebody black and being the only black person there, I don't believe that it ever happened, but I have no way of knowing it. But just knowing the racial politics of unless it was an all-black theater, and I don't think it was, right? Of course not. I just can't imagine that they would let this black man up there laughing his ass off in whatever year this is.
I prefer to think it's an exaggeration.
Okay,
but not wholly a fiction.
Okay, well, I'll accept that. But the other footnote is Tobacco Road was one of those touchstones in our generation, but within black culture, but the TV version. And Jeter Lester was played by Walter Brennan. And we would mock Jeter Lester of Tobacco Road. That was our way of talking about white trash people. And we would call them under our breath Jeter. Here come Jeter, here come Jeter, here come Jeter. And so
the movie of it with Gene Tierney? I mean, that...
Yeah, the only movie
There
I
wasn't
know.
a TV show of it.
No, a movie.
When it came on. Okay.
But we saw it on television.
Yeah.
And Walter Brennan plays Jeter Lester. And he calls himself Jeter Lester of Tobacco Road. Yeah. And so we would call white people Jeter under our breath, which is just another footnote. Good. So anyway,
that's good.
Have you thought about the laughter and the...
Laughter is an index of humanity. I don't think Ellison is being that anthropological and political, and I would prefer to say that laughter that you can trace in the way he does to recognition is more like a sign of thought. It's more like a sign of an intelligent person, of a certain kind of intelligence. Laughter betrays a lot of things, doesn't it? But there was an article years ago by Oliver Sacks about Alzheimer's patients watching Ronald Reagan give a speech on TV, and they laughed. Sacks, whether tendentiously or not, traced this to a kind of intelligence that was still there as a residue. I think Ellison has that more in mind, that laughter has judgment in it, and it also incorporates social norms without having to speak them, and penetrates them in a way that isn't always possible without joking. He was fascinated with humor, and one of the reasons, well, I don't know whether he was a good raconteur when he wanted to be in the right company or not. He was said by many people, it comes out in the Rampersad biography, to be quite solemn and almost deliberately banal. When he was on a panel with two or three others, people felt deliberately be the most boring and bland person there.
Not at the Century over lunch when he drank lunch.
When he drank lunch.
When he drank.
So anyway.
Which was every day.
I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Maybe it's another question.
Good. Yes.
Hi.
Matt, what time do we actually have to finish? And then we can have a drink. Okay, great. Glenda?
Thank you for your lecture. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about, you spoke about anger, Richard Wright's anger, Ellison's anger, and whether you could, I guess, think about, with us, about Ellison, anger, and comedy, right? I think this is a sort of two-part question. First, the first part would be that Wright's anger, I think, is overrated by critics. People tend to see him as this ferocious writer, which I think is a misreading of Wright. So I could see Ellison and Wright working in trying to give formal shape to anger. And I wondered whether, for you, you see a connection between Ellison's sense of anger and comedy. And this also springs from a few things you had to say about pathos and tragedy.
Well, I think Ellison is a much more organized and characteristically modern sensibility in his understanding of the nature of fiction, the nature of art. He's read James, he's read Flaubert, he's read Kenneth Burke, but some of the new critics too. He came to be a close friend of Robert Penn Warren and probably had some of the aesthetic orientation of that group. That makes for an understanding of art as sublimation. That is to say, it turns into something higher, tensions are released and reconciled, and so on. I agree with you that it's very possible to overrate the anger of Richard Wright. The interesting thing about Ellison's reply to Irving Howe is it's Howe who has chosen in this essay, and they both knew Wright. Ellison was quite close to Wright for some years. He erases that in this account too. Howe wasn't close to him, but was friendly with him and is trying to restore a kind of justice to Richard Wright's reputation. And for the purpose of that essay, it's Howe who stresses this point of anger. But Ellison chooses not to deny that. He chooses, so to speak, to saddle Richard Wright with anger and say, I've learned how to sublimate it in a different way. If it's excessively cruel, the way Ellison treats the subject in The World in the Jug, he is perhaps excessively kind to Richard Wright in his review of Black Boy, where the whole proto-Ellison-Murray theory of the blues is spun out and hung onto Wright's autobiography, which is not as poised as Ellison and Murray felt the blues had to be. I was reading in the Murray correspondence the letter Ellison writes to him about the 1958 Newport Jazz Festival. I mean, there the sense of high art and all that's been lost by these terrible new, hard boppers like Horace Silver, so corrupt, so bad, that you get the feeling that there's a sort of refinement he is searching for that isn't even any longer quite available to him. There was one other thing I wanted to say about Wright, but it slips my mind now.
Thank you.
Yes, questions? Just wait for the microphone.
Hi, thank you for the talk and the constellation you brought together. I'm reminded of a few lines, and I'm trying to think about the relation between anger, violence, art, and laughter. And there's a letter that Ellison writes to Richard Wright after seeing 400 Million Black Voices. And he says, God, it makes you want to write, or murder.
Yeah, he compares himself to Bigger Thomas in an encounter with a former colleague of his, an academic who had written for Negro Quarterly. That's reported by Rampersad, and it's very interesting. So there's another piece of suppression, that is to say, Ellison at different moments identifying himself both with Wright, who he says, I'm an individual, Wright is an individual, just what he allows himself to deny in the response to Irving Howe, but also, impulsive identification of himself with Richard Wright, which is as much as to admit the truth of Howe's perception, but it was true, that is to say, 20 years earlier, and Ellison denies that it ever could have been true.
Right.
Yeah.
But just, I wanted to bring that in conjunction with another line he says in an essay on American humor from 1970, where he says, you have to laugh at me so you don't have to kill me. And I have to laugh at you so I don't have to kill you. And that's always been struck me, because Ellison rarely speaks in those kinds of terms. And so that constellation of writing or murder, laughing or killing, and that notion that you brought up between what the artist's role is, or how he always saw himself as in society, what does the artist have to do? And maybe seeing in his responsibility either to evoke laughter or to create novels or essays as a means of not killing us.
Yeah, those are interesting quotations, and I have to look them up, so thank you for that. But I'm inclined to say that just as Ellison made too transcendent a thing out of laughter in some of the passages I quoted, my less favorite passages from that essay, Extravagance of Laughter, and elsewhere in Invisible Man too, I think he over-dramatizes and even makes melodramatic the importance of laughter in the bits that you quoted. We laugh or we murder. We laugh not to murder. It's anybody who's thought about human nature from Meredith to Bergson to Ellison or from oneself by introspection can say there is aggression in laughter. That's why Hobbes defined laughter as sudden glory. Hey, I'm above the guy who just fell flat on his face. Why do kids laugh all of a sudden when they see somebody fall? There's a moment in an otherwise somewhat indifferent movie about Billy the Kid, played by Paul Newman, called The Left-Handed Gun, where a man literally gets shot out of his boots, and a kid standing on the wayside starts laughing uncontrollably because he got shot out of his boots. So there's laughter as aggression, but I think Ellison's too reductive in some of these statements and overdramatic in others. He's, in spite of his great intelligence and capacity for irony, he has not always thought deeply when he sounds thoughtful.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I found myself listening to about the last 10 minutes of your lecture and just wishing you could just go over it and read it and reread it and reread it. It was.
Well, we have time.
But I just want to say two statements, one to you and one to Skip. I found myself thinking about the rhetorical statement that's or question that's kind of come into a lot of stand-ups acts lately. They'll tell a joke about a recent tragedy and then say the words, too soon. Like, too soon becomes a way of kind of mollifying reactions to someone telling a joke that just seems a little far too arch given not enough time to achieve comedy over tragedy. So that was just one thought I had. And the other was to what you were saying, Skip, about this earlier reference about risibility. And then my immediate thought went to the William Hazlitt quote, that man is the only animal that laughs. Man is the only animal that laughs and weeps, for he is the only animal that is struck with the difference between what things are and what they should be. But that comes from 1818. And then I saw that Jean de la Bruyere says in 1688 that, and this I thought really applied to the case of black people, we must laugh before we are happy, for fear we die before we laugh at all. So I don't know how it compares to your earlier quote, but it certainly seems.
Godwin took it from Aristotle.
Say that again?
He took the concept of laughter and humanity from Aristotle.
Yes.
But I didn't know those quotes.
Right, the idea of laughing because we may not get to.
In terms of discourse of race and reason, at least from my studies, it just drops out of the sky. No one else has said it before. I mean, maybe somebody did, but
You can tell black people are human because we laugh.
yeah.
Thanks.
But and Baldwin says the same thing about unless we do. How should I put it? Unless if we didn't do this, we would kill you. Baldwin says about Bessie Smith, right? Remember, the famous says.
If we didn't do
If
this,
she didn't sing the blues, she would have killed you. And Leroy Jones / Amiri Baraka, and I'm not sure if he was Leroy Jones or Amiri Baraka, said the same thing. So it's a motif in the tradition.
If it's when Blues People was published, he was still Leroy Jones, and that's reviewed by Ellison and reviewed with considerable hostility. It's an interesting essay.
Right, in the narrative of your books.
Yeah.
how related is that to the idea that the reason the South had these incredibly elaborate systems of manners and decorum was because it was such an incredibly violent society?
You can ask him. You can ask me.
Yeah, I know, right? Forgive me.
It's because they had to be both Greece and Highland Scotland at the same time. The islands, the Highlands, the clans, and Athens. So, I mean, no, don't ask me about the South.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, Matthew, who's next? Oh, and Edward Paul.
Howdy. I wonder if we could fast forward 50 years to the present and two black novelists who are writing in a comic tradition. Thinking about Paul Beatty, whose novel last year, The Sellout, won the Booker Prize and is a coruscating satire about a so-called Negro whisperer in Los Angeles. And Colson Whitehead, who has veins of bitter comedy in The Underground Railroad. Is it possible that the tradition unfolded by Ellison is continuing almost unmodified in present African American?
I read very
fiction?
little. I read very little contemporary fiction. I have to confess that. But I would think it's continuing not only in fiction, but in essay writing and in some stand-up comedy, some of the slower-paced kind of stand-up comedy that hooks you slowly. It's a vein that's very deep, and it's not confined to as I think he understands it, isn't by his homage to Caldwell. It's not confined to black writers or black comic performers. It's there in Mark Twain, and Twain's performances like the Man Who Corrupted Hadleyburg seem to me somewhere in the background of Ellison's work in Extravagance of Laughter, work of approximately the same length. There's a tall tale quality. There's the deliberate, maybe the word extravagance refers to this, winding sort of long-windedness of it. He could do those sort of sentences. He did them a bit in Invisible Man, but he really takes his full swing in this essay. And I guess he is almost by nature, he is by second nature an uninhibited and perfectionist personality, Ellison is. But in this essay, which I bet he worked at as hard as he ever worked at anything, there's a feeling of freedom that approaches the strongest, I think, aesthetic sensation one can have from listening to jazz. And it's not in many places in the arts, in writing, and Ellison always aspired to it, and I think he hit it here. So,
sorry,
the one from 19. Oh yeah, the polemic against Irving Howe, I think, it's extraordinary. It's very eloquent, but it's a more ordinary performance. Should add just as a little footnote, since Skip is into footnotes. In the days of the first worries about academic political correctness, when I was writing a couple of essays in support of the idea of traditional education and the canon, I sent a note to Irving Howe, who was a friend, and told him, if you want to see what these conflicts are about, go back and reread Ellison's reply to you and see how it might seem to a black writer that Ellison was striking a blow for freedom, that in some sense he had the right end of it, even though you meant something more complicated than he gave you credit for. And I got a very short, characteristic typed postcard back from Irving Howe, which went like this. I took your advice and reread the Ellison essay. I thought he made the necessary points at sufficient length.
I'm sorry, but you can ask him again. Sir, final question.
I've had the good fortune of knowing Horace Silver when he lived right over here in Chelsea.
Horace Silver?
Right.
Oh.
He had a very
the one person I ever suggested for a Yale honorary degree.
He had a very schizophrenic, bipolar personality about himself. Mm-hmm. Okay? Never once would he include Cape Verdean rhythms into his music. He wanted to be perceived as European. Okay? And Ellison and a number of them in that period, they wanted to be accepted by the mainstream. So they were always downplaying things. That's just what got Walt Disney in trouble with the movie Song of the South. After James, who was a chemist, played Uncle Remus, at the end of the movie, he was to be banished from the plantation because he was too old to work. You did it another way here, which is like some of the music people in New York are doing. I can write a nice composition, but they will not publish it unless I refer to myself as an N. Okay? There's no such thing as a Negro American. Okay? There are Africans who are misplaced here in America. Your presentation wasn't bad, but you need to get rid of, every once in a while, going back and forth, Negro this, Negro that. The thing is, Europeans had problems saying Niagara River.
Oh, yes, but
okay. I understand the period he's talking about.
He was not calling African Americans Negroes. He was quoting from Ellison, who used the word Negro.
Because Ellison had that same problem.
Yeah, but you can't blame David for Ralph Ellison. You can blame David for something.
That's
We're going around the same circle.
It's a historical difference. Yeah. I won't say Aristotle's reader, she, because
when I lecture, if I make statements about Eastern Europeans, they get mad with me.
No. You can't.
Be patient.
We can take this over drinks. But I think, since you asked me, I think if Frederick Douglass called himself colored, and I am writing about something about Frederick Douglass, I professor of African American and African studies, I used the term that black people used at the time. And that's fine. That is my own quirk, and I will make no apologies for this. But this man, our guest, was not calling African Americans Negroes. He was merely quoting Ralph Ellison. And along the way, doing a brilliant, that's enough. We can take this, we can continue over drinks, but what I want to do is thank my friend and my classmate for a brilliant, brilliant set of lectures. Thank you.
Thanks for that last bit.